Hello, Grace Bible Church family. Due to some extenuating circumstances with my wife and our pregnancy, we've opted to put my testimony on camera so that it can be played whether I'm there or not on Monday night. I may be in the audience and watching myself on the big screen right now, but hey. Anyway, I was very excited and nervous when Dr. Carey asked me to participate in this. Depression and mental health are subjects that have to be talked about. I would say especially in the church, and but they can be very hard to talk about. They're not well understood, and it can be difficult to talk about personal things like that, of course. So I know tonight is primarily about depression, but my testimony not only includes depression, but also rather severe obsessive-compulsive disorder, especially in a Christian context. So I'll be talking a bit about that. I'm just going to open with a Bible verse here. I'm going to go into a testimony that I actually wrote a while ago, but is still quite relevant to where I'm at today. And then we'll finish up from there. So thank you for lending me your ears tonight. The verse I wanted to share with you is a proverb. Proverbs 18:13. He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him. This is something that I have been guilty of several times in my life, and I think we all have. Judging a situation, a circumstance, judging a disease, something, whatever it is, that we don't really know anything about. Unless you've personally dealt with it, or you know someone you love has personally dealt with it, it's highly unlikely that you really understand whatever it is, and in this case it's depression. The word in this verse, to hear, is the Hebrew word shama, and it means to hear, to listen, to obey, to hear, perceive by ear, to hear with attention or interest, to understand, to listen, to give heed. So you can see that this is not just let's read all the articles that are against this point of view and then now we know everything. It's let's really hear this out. Both sides, the personal stories, the medical side of it, and the biblical side of it, of course, and let's find out what it's all about. And that's when our eyes start to open up, and we have to be willing to hear before we have any right to make any kinds of judgments or preconceived ideas. We think of things like epilepsy. People used to think epilepsy was caused by demon involvement, and of course we know now no one would say that. We realize that it's a neurological disorder. It's a brain malfunction. And we're going to learn that really that's all mental illness is usually as well. There's also an emotional component, and I think of another verse, Matthew 4:24. It's also suggestive because in it Jesus is healing the sick, and it outlines three specific types of illness in there. One is demon possession, which we would think of today as spiritual problems and so forth. The third one is paralysis, which we would think of as a physical problem. And the second one, though, is it's been translated as epilepsy or epileptic in most translations. Whether that's the correct, the most accurate or not, we don't know, but it indicates that there is this third category that is not spiritual and not physical in the sense of a stubbed toe. It's something a little bit different. It's specifically to do it seems to me in this verse with the brain and the moods and that kind of psychological type of stuff. So anyway, I'm going to get into my testimony right now. And I did write this a few years ago, but like I said, it's quite relevant to today. So here we go. So this could be tough to write. It's half personal testimony and half creating awareness to society in general and the church in specific. It's about mental illness, and it's my personal story of dealing with depression and OCD. Although leaps and strides have been made in the understanding and awareness of mental health issues, there is still so much to learn and understand for those who do not suffer with them or know someone who suffers with them personally. The stigma of mental illness remains quite firm in many areas of society. It could be the church, it could be the sports world, it could be the workplace, school, wherever it is. It's something that's invisible, and so it's hard for us to comprehend it. And I suppose there's people who could maybe fake or enhance their problems, and so we tend to throw everyone in the same bucket. But we need to, again, look into the matter, hear the matter, and then we'll find out a lot more about it. So when I was a teenager, I struggled with depression, but as a very devout Christian, I took it all as spiritual. Not physical or mental or anything like that. Never thinking it might be a mental illness. I would struggle in prayer with God for hours, thinking I'd done something wrong. When I was 18, I had my first breakdown. But again, I chalked it up to a spiritual thing. And the people closest to me, my parents and friends, they didn't know what to do because there wasn't a lot of information about this type of stuff then. And they cared deeply for me, but they didn't really know what to do. It was a terrifying time for me, very terrifying. And but my parents throughout it all were just incredible. They stayed with me. They had my back. Whatever it was, they would do it. My dad used to say that he'd pee in a spark plug for me if he thought it would help. But it wouldn't help. But it was a very nice thought. So anyway, I want to thank them so much for all they've been then and all through my life. They've helped me through this. My next breakdown came when I was in my early 20s. I was living in Prince George, BC. At this point, I was still treating it as a completely spiritual problem, although this time I learned my first lesson about mental illness. Again, I was you have to understand that I was young. I was idealistic as far as spiritual things were concerned. I was very legalistic in my mind. I had a lot of pride, which is not uncommon for a young Christian man. And I learned that pride was part of the problem, actually. So, I mean, there is that spiritual element to it as well. But the pride was really what was keeping me from seeing the mental illness part of it. So, this is my first lesson in it. It was actually the wife of my elderly pastor at the time who said, "I don't think this is oppression, spiritual oppression, as I thought and pretty much everyone else did, but depression." Those were her exact words. This was a lady who was very elderly. She was bedridden. She was very ill physically. And basically all she did all day was pray. She was a prayer warrior, and everyone in our church knew it. If you wanted something to be prayed about, you asked Renee Mae Carter. So when she said this to me, I took it seriously. This was a godly woman. And like I said, wiser words may have never been spoken. As Christians, we often want to put everything into a box and just pray it away. And I'm not saying that I don't think we should pray about mental health, because of course we should. My faith and my prayer life and the Bible have been the lifelines that have gotten me through mental health. issues that I've had. And without them, I just don't know where I'd be. I really don't. I don't want to think about it, to be quite honest with you. So my faith and a good theology is essential to get through this, but we also have to understand that it is a separate disease that needs to be treated as such. Even the most legalistic or conservative thinking Christian would be inclined to get medical attention should they break their leg. Mental illness, properly understood, is no different. I understand that psychiatry has had a bit of a strange history, and I understand all of that, but we tend to throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to psychology and psychiatry. And what we need to understand is that God created the mind, He created the brain, and that is simply the study of the mind and the brain. And people, godly people like Dr. Carey, who also understand the psychological and psychiatric aspects of this, they're rare, and they're also wonderful to have around. I thank God for him and another psychologist that I've worked with, and we're just very lucky that we have someone like that in our church. I just want to say that up front, as well as Lynn Dewing, who works with CMHA. Now, having said this, I'm going to get into a little bit of story where God has a sense of humor and I had a lot of pride and ignorance. I was young but had firm opinions about so-called mental illness and the medications that went with it. This was brought to the forefront one day when I was preaching at my little church in Prince George. I was speaking about the joy of the Lord, I believe, when in my youthful fervor I exclaimed, "We don't need Prozac to be happy. That is just a crutch. The Lord makes us happy." Well, apparently that night, one of the dear mum-like ladies in our church had brought her brother to church, and this was the first time in a long time he had come. He was not particularly religious at all. It turns out that he was actually on Prozac at that time. And I had greatly offended him. Although I still didn't believe in mental illness, or even the drugs that went along with it, I realized I had to apologize for what I had said and the way I had said it. So I made the difficult phone call to this man, and he graciously accepted my apology. But that's not where the irony ends. It was not long after this that I had suffered that second breakdown I just mentioned. My pastor's wife had suggested depression, and for the first time in my life, I was open to hear about it, to listen, actively engage, to learn about it. With an entirely new perspective on life, I went to my doctor, and he had me fill out a little questionnaire on depression. I scored off the chart for severe clinical depression. I tried a series of different drugs, and that can be a difficult time, until at last one seemed to really help me. It seemed to take the edge off and just help me think more clearly. And it's called fluoxetine. It's otherwise known as Prozac. So God has a sense of humor. The very drug I decided to name from the pulpit and denounce, it probably wasn't a month later that I was personally taking it and thanking God that He had brought it into my life. So we need to understand that the medications, although again the history of that can be strange sometimes, we feel they've been over-prescribed sometimes by doctors. Again, we cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater. These medications save lives. They help people lead more fulfilling lives and more stable lives, and we cannot judge people who are on these medications. It's a personal decision. It's a very personal issue between you, your doctor, your family, and God. But don't just throw it out. Don't just say no. There's absolutely no way. You give it serious consideration. It is something that God has provided, and it may be what He wants to help you or someone you love. I don't believe it's the complete answer, but it is a tool of medicine that God's given us, and it's just like any other we would take for any other more socially acceptable disease. One thing I'd like to mention, especially here, is the difference between diagnosing and labeling. I've had people talk to me and say that labeling, when a doctor diagnoses us with some type of thing like OCD or depression, it's just a label, and we get dragged down by that label, and it just makes us more depressed. I couldn't disagree more. True diagnosis is finding the truth. And Jesus said, when you find the truth, it will set you free. And that is what true diagnosis is. So don't be afraid of it. It's not admitting that you're crazy to find out that you have a mental health issue. It's finding the truth. And then you can begin to treat it the best way that you, your doctor, and family think is good. And to go on from that, once I accepted the fact that I may have depression, I realized this was a much more common thing among Christians and others than I realized. Charles Spurgeon, no less than Charles Spurgeon, fought with serious depression, and he preached on it. I have a sermon of his in written form, and I'll get you a copy if you want one. It's, considering it was written in the mid-18th century, it is remarkably insightful into mental illness, by the way. And of course, we know Charles Spurgeon, one of the godliest men, one of the godliest preachers ever lived. Winston Churchill described it as the black dog that beset him. Another has said it was the beast that lay on my chest at night and rode my back during the day. Martin Luther and John Bunyan both have experienced mental illness and depression as well as OCD. But back to my testimony. About 10 years ago, I had my last breakdown brought on by stress. And as I look back, I can realize that the others were brought on by pretty severe stress as well. This time, my diagnosis was a bit more specific. As well as depression, I discovered that I had a severe case of obsessive-compulsive disorder. And one of the like I just mentioned, Martin Luther and John Bunyan, who's the author of The Pilgrim's Progress, it is quite clear to me and actually to psychologists that these two great men struggled with OCD, specifically in a spiritual format. And I've read the biographies, and I just see myself there so much. So they were able to deal with it, even though they didn't maybe have a lot of information about mental illness, but they realized that there's truth, and then there's this fiction that their mind is kind of assaulting them with. So many people associate OCD with constant hand washing, but there are really many forms. I won't go into all the details, but the things I tend to obsess over are spiritual things, as are the compulsions that follow. Things like constantly being afraid that you're going to lose your salvation for things that other people would see as pretty trivial or just ridiculous. And I say that because they're seeing it from a clear, objective point of view, whereas the person with depression or OCD tends to do what we call emotional reasoning. And instead of looking at the facts or the truth of the Bible, they believe what they feel more than what is objectively true. So I was diagnosed with this while dating my now wife. She experienced it firsthand and stood by me all the way. She even chose to marry me, despite having seen the ugly side of this OCD. And I can't thank her enough. She's been everything to me. She's helped me. She's never judged me. She's never looked down on me. And it's amazing. However, in this case, the worst was yet to come. After a few months of wedded bliss, it hit me again. The next 2 months were at times indescribably horrible. Some of the worst times of my life, and now I was dragging someone through it with me. Although not hospitalized, I spent about a month in a mental health transition house. My wife and I made the difficult and, to me, humiliating decision for me to enter this house, this program. We met with a psychiatrist at this place, who I later found out was a Christian, wasn't Dr. Carey, but it was another one in our own community. And that was just so helpful to me because I had a person who understood my spiritual beliefs and also who understood the psychological aspect of things. It was a real blessing. As my wife left to go back to our new rental suite that we had just moved into after getting married, and I entered my little room in this little house where I would spend the next month with some other folks who were suffering with mental health issues and the nurses and doctors that worked there, I broke down in tears, and they didn't stop for at least a month. I can only imagine what my wife went through as I was rendered useless as a husband. I thank God for her so much. Her unshakable faithfulness to me is something I will never forget, and it keeps me going every day. I've been taking certain medications that my wife, doctor, and I feel are appropriate for this disease, and equally important, I have learned many methods of dealing with it. My wife actually found a book written by a Christian psychologist about obsessive-compulsive disorder called The Obsessive-Compulsive Trap. It's led by Dr. Mark Crawford. It's helped me in amazing ways. The ultimate lesson I learned through that time was this. God taught me, I would dare say he told me, in that little room, in that little house, as I was desperately calling out to him. He said, separate me from your mental illness. We are not one and the same thing. I am not the voice in your head that is angry with you. Believe the truth, not your feelings or wayward thoughts. To this day, that I use that as strength to get through every day. One of my favorite movies is called The Beautiful Mind. You may have seen it with Russell Crowe. It's actually this true story of John Nash, Nobel Prize winner who suffered from schizophrenia. Because I identify with the story so much, and I love how well done it is. At one point in the movie, John Nash tries to explain to a friend what it's like to have a mental illness. In this case, it was schizophrenia, and he would see things that weren't actually there. Again, though, it's based on sort of how you're feeling and the brain disorder. In the movie, he says, I still see things that are not there. Or I could say I still feel things that are not true. I just choose not to acknowledge them. Like a diet of the mind, I choose not to indulge certain appetites. Managing our mental health is so important. We take care of our physical health. We certainly want to take care of our spiritual health. We need to take care of our emotional and mental health as well. If we don't, it will be to our detriment, and to the detriment of fellow believers and family members and friends. I know many Christians who love the Lord, and those who are not Christians, and they struggle with mental illness, depression, OCD, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. We as the church need to recognize the reality of this, become educated, hear the matter, listen, and compassionately help them. I have put this testimony, as well as a similar one about OCD, onto a blog of mine on the internet, obviously there. And since I put it up, this personal testimony has had 627 hits from all over the world. And the one about OCD specifically has had 3,321 hits. That's how many people are searching for answers to what they're going through and try to reconcile their faith with this terrible illness that they're suffering from. I've talked to people from the States. I've talked to one girl from Bulgaria, and even kind of walked alongside her through email as she told her family what she was feeling, and went to a doctor and got on some meds that are helping her. And we just need to realize this is real and admit it for ourselves and also for our family and friends and fellow believers. So, with that in mind, we know that famous verse that for God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and a sound mind. 1 Timothy 1:7. And so, what this tells me is not that we will always have a sound mind, but that is God's intent and desire for us. And when we realize that the diseases can sometimes affect this, not just, daily troubles, circumstantial issues, but actual brain disorder things, then we can start to get at the root of the problem. And I think Dr. Carey is going to talk more about that. And I just thank you for listening tonight. Have a good night. Bye.